So my name is Laura Knittel. I am a former second grade teacher. I taught second grade, hardest job I've ever had. Love the little ones, but it was a lot. And then I went to law school, and now I represent school districts. So I kind of feel like I won the life lottery as far as jobs go. I still get to be involved with parents and students and families, but in a different capacity where I'm not like getting sick every day of the week and, feeling exhausted. I have such admiration for you guys. So I really want this to be interactive today, and if you have questions, I really want you to feel free throughout to ask them. I want to know what are, these are the things that I've identified as being hot topics right now and things that people have a lot of questions about. But I really want you to feel comfortable asking questions, and I'm going to stay around a little bit afterwards, so if there's something you want to come and talk to me about privately, we can do that. We really appreciate your partnership. Those of you who are parents coming out today, it means so much that you're involved in this process and you want to learn more, and you make us better so as school districts and administrators, right? So we really appreciate you being here. Oh, I didn't mention this, but I used to work at a firm called Frantic Rattlet, and we left in May. So now we have all this new, we're trying to be really interactive and good with our publicity. So we're going to test this PowerPoint out today. If it goes awry, I apologize. So this is the agenda. These are some of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about medication and things that we need help with when we're, figuring out healthcare plans and 504 plans. And we just want you as parents to be aware of kind of what we're dealing with on the school side with medication. Student health issues, we're going to talk a little bit about that. It kind of goes with the medication piece. We just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Aaron's Law is a law that I just want you guys to be aware of and let you know from the school setting how that's implemented and what it's about. Anne Marie's law is the same, so not the same law, but the same purpose. I want to make sure you guys are aware of that. And mandated reporting, confidentiality, and then just a few other updates and questions at the end. Anything you have questions about? Okay, so we're a little bit about EpiPens and allergies generally, right? So this is something, there was a case a few weeks ago, a really unfortunate case where a kid, I don't know if you heard about this, but was eating cookies and didn't realize that the cookies had peanut butter in them, right? And so we're seeing a big uptick in parents having concerns, understandably, about allergies at school, right? So if you have a student with an allergy, you likely have an EpiPen. And the law provides that students can self-carry those, right? So a student can get a prescription, come to school, administer their own EpiPen, the end, right? Good to go. You just need to provide documentation to the nurses who may have different opinions on these things, which they should feel free to jump in on. But that's pretty established, right? A few years ago, the law changed so that districts can have undesignated EpiPens at buildings. So that means that a student doesn't have a prescription that's tied to that EpiPen, right? It just means that we have this barrel of it's not a barrel, but we have these EpiPens. If somebody has an allergic reaction, we can administer them. How many do we have in buildings here, generally?
2 adult and 2 pediatric.
2 adult and 2 pediatric, okay. So there's a ton of protection for district employees, and I want parents to be aware of that too when you're administering EpiPens, right? There's a lot of, if an employee reasonably believes that a student's having an allergic reaction, he or she can administer the EpiPen, right, without any sort of liability associated with that. And that's really to protect students who go into anaphylactic shock or have an allergic reaction at school, right? And so what happens is at the beginning of the year, you'll get some sort of notice, right, from the nurse, or you fill out some sort of medication administration form if you do have a prescription for the EpiPen. If you don't, if somebody sees you having an anaphylactic reaction at school, they could administer an undesignated pen to you. So that's just something to be aware of. If your student has an allergy, you want to get in touch with the building, make sure that everybody knows what it is. My overall feedback on a lot of this is sometimes staff members have to end up kind of like hunting down people to get information about the EpiPen or get information about diabetes and the healthcare plan. If staff members don't have detailed information about the allergies and what to do in the event of an allergic reaction or what to do in the event of a diabetic reaction, then they just have to administer emergency care. That's my advice, right? So emergency care being we call 911 if somebody's having a diabetic reaction at school, or we call 911 if somebody's having anaphylactic reaction, which is what should happen anyway, right? But just know that in the absence of those healthcare plans, it makes it a little bit, we have to just do emergency care. Any questions about that and EpiPens and the allergies? Okay. So there's another law about medication. So this was actually pretty big. Last year, my partner, Darcy Korea, and I worked on this together. So there's this little student who's in Schaumburg 54. This is all public. You can Google it. So I'm not revealing any confidential information. But she's an elementary school student, and she had epilepsy as a result of chemotherapy treatments. So she had a lot of seizures, tried a ton of different medications, nothing worked, right? She went to like a bajillion doctors and finally found a doctor who prescribed her medical marijuana. So it's just an oil that goes under a patch under her wrist. Unbeknownst to staff, she was wearing it to school for a while. And it came to a point where she actually needed it, and she needed a second dose at school. So she would come to school, she needed a second dose just to control the seizures. So she, the school said, she came to school, parents came to school, they were like, we really want you to administer this medical marijuana. The school said, we're prohibited by law from administering it because you can't have, there's a medical marijuana law, and it specifically says in schools you can't have it, even if you have a valid prescription for it. So that was an unfortunate series of events. We actually learned a little bit later that as it was drafted, the legislators in the beginning when they were drafting this law, they actually wanted to allow for it at school, but they got a lot of pushback at the school level from nurses and other staff who were concerned about the presence of marijuana, which is still, it's on the class schedule of controlled substances that are prohibited. So there was some concern and some pushback about having even medical marijuana. So ultimately, that exception at school was taken out. So the school said, listen, we can't do this. We would love to help your daughter. We've seen such positive effects of this. We want to help, but we just can't. So Steve Glink is an attorney who works often with parents, and parents lined up with him, and they actually filed a lawsuit in federal court in the Northern District of Illinois, saying that it violated their students' right to an education, a free, appropriate public education, by not allowing her to have the medical marijuana at school. Because in all honesty, without it, she couldn't function at school, right? She's having seizures, she's not being able to attend to her education. So they filed a lawsuit, and Darcy and I responded, and we went to court, and so the state's attorney was there, right? So the state's attorney had to come to the court hearing. The attorney general was there because they were suing the state too. So we all go to court, and it's like the happiest court hearing you've ever seen because everybody's on the same page. They're just like, we can't do this. So we're all holding hands, the parents crying. It was this whole you love cases like that where it's like a love fest. Everybody's really happy. So we, basically the end of that first hearing, the conclusion was that the state's attorney said, we're not going to prosecute any staff members in this district if they're administering or allowing a parent to administer medical marijuana. So it just applied to that one district. A victory for Ashley was her name, Ashley Surin. But then the law changed. So there were more districts. It was actually funny. After we left court that day, we walked downstairs and there were a ton of cameras. Megyn Kelly from the Today Show called and she wanted us to come get an interview. It was we became celebrities kind of. It was kind of funny. But we went downstairs for interviews, and Darcy, there were all these cameras and the microphones, and Darcy's like, come on, come up with me. And right now I'm like, oh God, I'm on camera. But she pulled me up, and then she's like, all of a sudden I looked over and you were gone. When she was talking, I was just kind of sliding out of the frame. I did not want to be on it. And she was like, next time this issue comes up, you're going to be front and center. But that was her moment. So afterwards, there were a lot of districts who said, we want to be able to do this too, right? We feel like there's a medical benefit to this. We want to be able to have students have it at school. So Darcy actually worked with the district on drafting that legislation. So Ashley's Law is what it's called, in honor of Ashley Surin. And what it does is it allows parents, so when parents get a medical marijuana card, you have to actually apply for it, and your doctors have to prescribe it, so it's not something you can just get off the internet, right? When they present that and they get medical marijuana, they can come to school and they can administer the medical marijuana to their student. It doesn't allow staff members to administer it. It doesn't allow us to store it at school. Parents literally come to school, put it on, and then they leave. What are some problems that are associated with that, right? Sometimes parents can't get to school to administer it. So we're seeing some pushback, and I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a change in the law, right? Because some parents just can't get off to come in the middle of the day to administer it. The state has said in public that ISB is not actually monitoring this. They're not policing this. So in the event, some districts have chosen to do things that I wouldn't necessarily advise them to do, but they're doing that, right? So the ISB is not going in and prosecuting people for doing this. But that's something that's in the air. If you have a student who has a seizure or a seizure disorder and has been prescribed medical marijuana, that's something that you should be in touch with student services folks about that. Any questions about that? It's really interesting. If you Google it, you can see some clips and you can see the family. It was an interesting turn of events. Times have changed. Did anybody see it? A little bit? Yeah, it's on the news, right? Fun times. Any questions about medication? Okay. Anything our nurses want to share that they feel like I haven't covered? Not to put you on the spot, you don't have to say anything, but.
I'm just kind of curious how it eventually would work out if they did say they wanted staff to do it. Like, who do they mean by staff? Because we have a Nurse Practice Act that governs what we can and cannot do.
Exactly. So you've identified a huge tension there, right? So the Nurse Practice Act does govern that, right? And says that we're not supposed to be administering that. So I think there's going to have to be a revision to that in order to allow, technically, another staff member could administer it. We can't force teachers to do that, but an administrator could administer it. But you've identified what is the tension in ISB right now with the nursing department and the rest of ISB as far as like, how are we reconciling that? Because I totally agree and I totally understand. I think both of them, in order for it to work, both of them have to be revised in tandem. That's a great question. Any other questions?
I just have one
Yeah.
comment as far as EpiPens
Totally.
go. We just still really encourage every parent that has a child with a severe allergy to provide their own. I mean, because those
Yes.
are truly. If,
Yes.
You know,
Right,
have
Yes.
somebody
They
that's
don't
not
travel on
diagnosed.
field trips
Yes.
as well. So
Yes.
it's so important for known allergies.
So if they have their own EpiPen, it's following them everywhere, right? The undesignated pen's just in case of an emergency where a kid doesn't have one or like we don't have access to the kids. That's when you would administer the undesignated pen. So it is really important that parents provide. That's a good point. Any other questions about that? And the same is true of inhalers, right? So if your kid has asthma, we should be providing inhalers and they can self-carry that at school too. So just make sure that you're keeping staff abreast of that and you're keeping up to date with the medicine you're supposed to have. Student health. So this goes along with this a little bit. There was a really bad case a couple years ago. This student, I don't know if you guys have heard of it, this student had a really severe asthma attack in the middle of the classroom. So he was in the back of the room. The teacher kind of, saw him having the attack, but it was like a newer teacher, didn't really know what to do, kind of got freaked out. Instead of calling 911 immediately, ended up calling the nurse, which was like a lag time because the nurse is coming from the central office and coming from the main office of the building. And the student ended up dying actually in the classroom. And his estate was awarded a substantial amount of money because the court found that lag time was an issue, right? Like we should call 911 immediately. So just know that if your student's having that sort of reaction in class and having an asthma attack, the advice that the state has given is that we immediately call 911. Like that's part of the plan. That's the asthma protocol, right? So we have to call 911. Sometimes districts I've found get some pushback. Sometimes parents don't want you to call 911. They feel like, we got to go pick our kid up from the ambulance. We got to deal with this. And I totally understand and respect that. But just know that that's what they have to do, right? So that's something that's been mandated by the state. We have to call 911 in those situations. And there's just no avoiding that. The diabetes care plan, I talked about this a little bit, but I had a district recently where a kid has a diabetes care plan, but they haven't gone to the doctor in like a year and a half, so it's technically out of date, right? So the advice has always been, if it's out of date, we're just providing emergency care like I described earlier. So that's why it's really important when the district asks for those things that we're providing them. The asthma action plan, I'm just going back a little bit on that, is every year as a parent, you're gonna get a request from the district that you provide the asthma action plan. That's our duty, is to ask for it, to request it, but if you don't provide it, we have to provide emergency care, but we can't hunt it down from you necessarily. I mean, we could, but ultimately we've met our burden when we ask for it. So it's really important when you do receive that request that you're being responsive to getting that back to parent, or getting that back to staff just so they can move forward. Does that sound right? Do you guys have a hard time getting those sometimes? Yeah, it's hard to get those action plans for sure. So you're not alone. Aaron's Law. Has anybody heard of this? You have? Yeah, so it's pretty, parents are notified of this annually. And it's a sad situation. This woman, if you Google her, she's been amazing in her advocacy because she was sexually abused as a child. She ended up just being an advocate across the country. A number of states have passed Aaron's Law, most of them. And what it does is it actually mandates that schools provide training to assist in recognizing the signs of abuse in students. So this is something that the state requires us to do. It requires us to have a prevention-oriented child abuse program. We have to do it annually, but it's age-appropriate instruction, right? So it is those little kids through those high school kids, but it's age-appropriate. So the goal is that, little kids are learning, like, what's a good touch, what's a bad touch, when's a time that you need to report something to somebody. So it's really something, it's an important conversation. Not only is it required by state law, but it's also just important as a whole. I think I get more complaints than I would like, more, what ends up being an abuse and neglect investigation that I like in a school year, just because it's just prevalent and kids are learning how to report it, which is great. But just know that that's something that's going to happen. We would hope that your child would participate. I think there are very few generally whose parents choose not to have them participate, and then they do an alternative activity. But it's a really important program. When do you guys do it during the year generally?
Various times, because
Is it?
there's a group that comes out, and so some schools are scheduled here, some schools
are, okay. And do you bring somebody in for the training?
Yes.
You do, okay.
Do.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so you just do it throughout the year with bring somebody in. That's cool. Any questions about this or any? Yeah, please.
I do have a question. When
Sure.
I looked at Aaron's Law online,
Sure.
it made it sound like there was a component for training staff.
Mm-hmm.
Like adults are supposed to be getting training.
Yes, adults should get some training too. Is that, yeah.
Yes, that's part of our training, our online training through GNC.
Okay.
Yes, so it's our,
Oh, GNC, yeah. So you're online every year, teachers get trained on that. So that, for parents, that's like an all-encompassing training program that most districts use, and it has like training on administration of EpiPens and training on everything under the sun. So Aaron's Law is one of those components. But she has a really fascinating story if you're interested and want to review. Anne Marie's Law. So this is one thing I'll say that we've noticed, I guess over the past year in particular, like kids are in crisis right now. Like kids are very much in crisis, and it's a hard thing to watch. And I think oftentimes my districts, since we left the firm, we work with 35 school districts in the state. So at my old firm, we worked with over 100. So I've worked with districts everywhere, and they're all facing the same problem and I get the same phone calls almost universally, like kids are in crisis, kids are going to Alexian Brothers, kids are going to Compass, kids are just having these demands placed on them and they're not able to cope. What can we do? What can we do? So Anne Marie, another story that's motivated legislation, as they often do. We got Ashley's Law, Aaron's Law, Anne Marie's Law, right? So these real life events end up molding what our state laws are. But the student committed suicide. As a result of this, districts are required to provide a suicide and depression awareness and prevention program and some training to students on recognizing the signs of suicide, trained to staff on recognizing the signs of suicide, and training for students, I think it's grade 7th, starting 7th grade through 12th on recognizing those feelings in yourself, right? So that's actually a board policy that's outlined. Parents, you guys know how to access the board policies online? Your website's pretty cool. So there is, you can go to the board part. I went the other day to see this policy. So you go to the board part, and then you can go to policies, and you can access all of them online. So they're helpful to review and just kind of know they're like the district rules, right? The rule book that we follow. So that's actually board policy 7290. So if you have your kids are asking questions about that and, want to know what it is, it's a good thing to review, and just to know that this law is out there and it's conversations that staff are having, right? I brought this up, in tandem with bullying. So we've noticed a huge uptick in bullying complaints. And I think it's harder now than it was for all of us to be a kid just because of the prevalence of social media. And like kids could, I was actually talking about this at dinner earlier tonight, kids could go to school, deal with a bullying situation, an unfortunate bullying situation, they could go home and they would be done with it, right? Like it would be over. But now kids are connected all the time, right? They're connected 24/7 to their technology. They can always access another student and they can talk about things they shouldn't be talking about. So bullying is something that we are trying to manage, right? Like I have a situation in another district right now where a kid claims he was bullied for like 2 years and now it's bled over into him being in crisis, right? And he's at Compass and he's, you know, parents are looking at outplacing him. It goes to like special ed, 504 issues too. So it's really important. There's a board policy. Every district in the state of Illinois has a board policy. I think it's 7180 or 7190 in your board policy manual, and it lays out the process for investigating complaints of bullying. What is bullying? What should you be doing? What should be the process that districts are following in addressing bullying? So bullying really is, you know, it gets hard, and it's hard when you're counseling districts on what to do because, like, I'm using second grade because second grade was my year, but you get little second graders who are like poking each other with pencils and they're doing little kid things, and it's like, they're saying it's bullying, but is it bullying? You know, like how are we defining bullying? It really is that severe, pervasive conduct that's inhibiting a student from being at school that's really important. So, you know, cyberbullying is explicitly prohibited by state law and in your policy. So where do parents come in with that, right? So when it comes to our door, like if a district, if like you're in a class, right? The teacher's in a class and they hear that a student's being bullied, they'll immediately conduct an investigation, right? And they're supposed to try to do that within 10 days at the day it was filed. So they'll conduct an investigation. But it's really important on your end as parents too to report that, right? To let somebody know who can go through the motions of investigating that you feel like your son or daughter is being bullied or experiencing bullying. And you can just, you know, you can send an email. There should be a way to file a complaint anonymously. Just know that, you know, the district will conduct an investigation. And what we often want to know is like what happened at the end, right? So like what happened to the bully? Was there discipline that was handed out? And unfortunately, the district can't share that information. They can't share information about other students. So anytime you lodge, there's a student discipline issue, there's a bullying issue, you're not going to be entitled or be able to know about what happened to the other student. So just beware, and I think it's helpful if you're looking at your students' social media and their online profiles, just so you're monitoring what they're saying, and have a good grasp on that, and that you can respond appropriately. This is a little bit off subject, but still on. Social media and is a huge problem, and I'm on some of it, but I'm not on Snapchat. I hear a lot about Snapchat. The majority of my student discipline issues involve Snapchat because you take the picture and it's gone, but somebody took a screenshot of it and it's coming to us, right? So you want to make sure you're reiterating to your kids, like if it comes into school, if it's something that you did off of school grounds, right? So you sent a Snapchat out on school grounds or off school grounds when you were at home, and then an administrator, you know, this is a common scenario. I'll give you an example. So I had a kid last year, it happens all the time, who posted a picture with one of those really real looking BB guns on Snapchat and like cut off the tip. There's an orange tip on the fake ones or some colored tip. Cut it off. It looked like a AR-15. Like it looked like an assault weapon that he was going to bring to school. And he posted that on Snapchat and he said, I'm going to shoot up the school or something like that. That's happened multiple times in the past couple of years. So he posted that on Snapchat. Somebody took a picture. Parents found out, called the school, you know, SWAT team, cars everywhere. It was a huge disruption to the school day. And then, you know, the kid's like, I didn't mean it. I was just like, I was having fun. I'm 16 years old. I'm a boy. My frontal lobe isn't fully developed. He didn't say that, but sometimes that's true. So he, you know, did this and he made a mistake, right? But what ended up happening? We moved for expulsion and moved to expel him. And that's the reality of the world we're living in right now. It's hard to... It's hard because you have sympathy for the fact that he's a young kid and he's making a joke, but unfortunately there was a shooting this morning in North Carolina and schools have to take this very seriously. So just be aware, have those conversations with your kids about appropriate social media use. There are a lot of resources online. If you Google around, there's like some online educational programming that can kind of help guide your kid through social media use. I don't know if we have any curriculum on that here at the school ground building level, but if you wanted to talk to Shelley about it, I'm sure she could direct you somewhere. So just make sure you're having those conversations and make sure that you're reporting bullying incidents and keeping everybody in the loop on that. Any questions? Okay. And this kind of goes, a lot of this, Anne-Marie's Law and social emotional issues, if you're thinking about students, sometimes there's a need to go a step further, right? So sometimes an emotional issues become so pervasive that it's invading their ability to be at school and to perform at school, at which point the district may discuss opening a case study evaluation and talking about whether or not the student may be eligible. So having that knowledge and giving that knowledge to the district is really important for guiding next steps related to serving the student. So just want to make you aware of that. Okay, and mandated reporting. So this is just something to be aware of. In Illinois, teachers are mandated reporters. Teachers, anybody that's working with a student. Administrators and the mandated reporter. This DCFS mandated reporter training is part of the GCN training that we talked about earlier. Every year, administrators, teachers, everybody's a mandated reporter. Doctors are mandated reporters. Have to be trained on recognizing signs of abuse and neglect and what do you do, right? So there's, this is a really strict law. Like there's no gray area allowed here. And sometimes there are situations where administrators are like, well, a child reported this to me, should I call? My advice, and just so parents are aware, is always if you have to ask, you should call, right? Because if you even have to ask the question, call. And what happens after there's a call is DCFS does what it wants to do, right? So like our obligation is to make that initial report and then let DCFS take it from there. And sometimes that means conducting an investigation. Sometimes it means you don't hear from them again. Sometimes it's like a long drawn out process. It's hard to determine what that is. But that's what teachers and other people who are working with your student at the school level are obligated to do. So just know that that's something that happens. DCFS will often come to the school to actually interview students whenever there's a call. We don't interfere with the DCFS world, right? So as school district, school administrators, school teams, DCFS does their thing. We let DCFS have access to what they need to do their investigation. I kind of say once they get involved, they're like the empire that takes over everything, right? So, sometimes they don't want us to contact parents prior to an interview, and they let us know that. They will let us know if we can contact parents. So just know that this is something that happens. If you have questions about DCFS, you can Google. Any questions about mandated reporting? And there's actually a couple of cases right now. Criminal charges have been filed against staff members for failing to report. So it's something that's on the radar of state's attorneys and people in the state, and it's just something that people should be cognizant of. Any questions? Confidentiality. So the bullying stuff that I talked about, investigations, how we're not allowed to share other student information, this derives from state and federal law. So there's a law called the Family and Education Rights Privacy Act, FERPA. I just call it FERPA. And then there's the Illinois School Student Records Act. So when I was a young associate, when I just started at the firm, I got this awful, terrible assignment to look up all of the state's records law, the student records law for all the states in the country. And it was awful. It was pretty painful. Most states just have FERPA, which is the federal law, but Illinois is one of like 5 states that has its own little lovely variation on that. So just a few changes. You can nerd out and talk about that at the next dinner party or whatever you're at. Share that little tidbit of info. But student records are actually interesting from the standpoint of the School Student Records Act was written 20 years ago. Over 20 years ago. And it was written with the idea that a student record is a piece of paper, right? So it's like a document, it's something we're storing in files. Guess what, people? Technology has changed everything. Just like it's changed, student social emotional health and bullying, totally changed student records, right? So records are a big part of my practice, actually. Because the Student Records Act defines a record as anything by which a student could be individually identified, regardless of how or where it's stored. So it could be, an email communication. It could be technically like an evaluation that you're doing. It could be a document that a student generated at school and put their name on the top of it. That's a student record. So, that's something that's that you should know. You have access to the student records, so you can ask the school district for a copy of the student records. You could ask to come and review them, and you should be given those within 10 business days. The law actually used to say 15 school days, and it was changed effective over the summer, I believe, or early summer, to say 10 business days. So you can totally do that. Evaluation protocols, so if your student receives an evaluation, just know that districts can't technically release that to you. That's something that you could probably come in and look over with a team member, but evaluation protocols are actually copyrighted, right? So like a company makes them and we can't be giving copies of those to parents, but that's something to review. Mental health information, so if a student's over 12 and over, we have to receive their consent to send mental health information somewhere. Like if you wanted to send it to a judge or a friend or anybody, we would have to receive the student's consent to send that. So just know that that's protected by law. We often get requests for, like parents want copies if a student's receiving social work services. Parents sometimes request copies of like logs and notes related to the sessions. So logs are typically okay, they just identify like when you talk to the student, right? And they're just identifying date and time. But personal notes that the social worker's keeping during a session are their personal notes. So they're not technically a student record if that person's keeping them for their own use and hasn't shared them with anybody else. So just know that that's something that if it's personal, you wouldn't receive a copy of it. It's just for that staff member's use. Any questions about that? Has anybody made a student record? You don't have to say if you don't want to, but just know that I think at the building level, it's the principal that it generally goes to, the records request. Does it matter? Do you guys have a?
It can go to the principal, the case manager, the
Yeah.
registrar,
Yeah.
and then it comes to me.
Comes to you, the end stop. Yeah, so it's just a good thing to know. And then just know if you transfer, so if you go to another district, those records will go to the new district and you don't have to consent to them going. You'll receive notice that they're going, but they're gonna go regardless of whether or not you consent. Yes?
So your child's records wouldn't be able to be viewed by you that the social worker made, but that they would be able to be viewed by personnel at a new school?
So that's a good question. So I don't think I was gonna. So personal notes, like things that you are using for your own personal use, it's called the exclusive use exception in the law. So they're not even put in like the bucket of student records that would go anywhere. They're just for that person's exclusive use. But the other records that are considered student records, so if your student has an IEP, that's a student record. Attendance information is a student record. Grades, transcripts, those things are all records that go to the new school district if you transfer, or if the student's going from, you guys are a unit district, but in other instances where like a high school to middle school to high school situation, those will go with the student. So just know that that's something that happens and those go on to new districts. But no, that's a really good question about the logs. That's a good question. Any other questions about records? Yeah.
So what defines a mental health record?
That's a good question. So technically, there's a definition, and of course you're gonna ask me that, but I don't have the definition off the top of my head. But like these service logs that we're referring to, where a person's actually providing therapy service, like social work service, right? Where you're talking about there's a relationship there and there's confidential information being exchanged regarding the student's mental health. Like that's a record that's protected by the MHDDCA. So that's why what often happens is we'll get like a criminal case, right, where a judge wants to see mental health records, oftentimes in like abuse and neglect cases where a kid's been abused and then it's gone on to the criminal courts. And so that's a situation where they want to know like what the social worker knew, what constituted, like some of their sessions, what was the discussion. And if state's attorney wants to receive that, that's an instance where we say, okay, we need you to, a kid needs to sign the release saying, okay, you can send this information on because they're 12 or older. If they're younger than that, it doesn't apply. That's a good question. Does that make sense? Kind of, okay, yeah. Any other questions about that in student records? We often, so permanent records, those will stay 60 years until the date the student has from the date the student has graduated or transferred out of the district. So those stay forever and ever, and it's things like the attendance records, the identifying information, the transcript stays, other stuff goes away. Temporary records are things like IEPs, and those are things that would stay 5 years after the student transfers or otherwise graduates. And again, most things are stored electronically, so it's interesting to see as technology changes, what we're going to do with storage, but just a good thing to know. And then directory information, is everybody kind of familiar with that or not? Are you guys an opt-out district? I'm asking you all these, all on you.
Yes, we are an opt-out district and through the parent registration process.
You're an opt-out district through the parent registration process. So what that means, directory information, in the federal law and in the state law, they said, you know what, there's certain information that we can release without it being violative of a student's confidentiality rights. So such information is like name, address, phone number, like things that go in like your PTO, for instance, like a telephone directory, right? Like those are just really basic things that state and federal law have said, okay, you can release those without parental consent. Because otherwise, if it was like an IEP, for example, parents would have to consent to us giving that out to the public, right? For obvious reasons, it's confidential. But some information is so innocuous, they're like, okay, you can release that without violating a student's confidentiality. But we have to notify you every year about your right to opt out of having that released, right? So that should be through online registration. There's a little box that says, I do want directory information released, or I do not want whatever the setup is. Just know that directory information is those things that are very, PC. There's just name, address, date of birth, those types of things. So, any questions about that? Does anybody remember seeing that in registration? Yeah. Okay.
There's also the one for the pictures.
Pictures.
Pictures can be disclosed, or military information, there's a separate one for military.
Oh, you have separate forms for all of them?
It's a box.
Oh, separate boxes. Yeah.
Opt-out,
Yeah. So if you don't want your picture to be like in the yearbook, or you don't want the picture to be on like promotional materials for the district, you can put that in the, like on the website, for instance. You can check that box saying don't release that information. Any questions about that? Okay. Human trafficking. This is a negative note. We went from records to human trafficking. So there was an arrest. More than 450 people were arrested in Illinois pretty recently, a couple months ago. Actually, like in Arlington Heights, there was the majority of the arrests. There were 80 or so arrests. So now there's a new law that says we have to post this notice in school that basically provides the toll-free number to call if you feel like somebody's being a victim of human trafficking. So this is new law. The notice has to be posted starting in January, so it's not something that's gone into effect yet, but it's something for parents to be aware of too. So if you feel like you've come in contact with a student who's the victim of human trafficking, you call this number. There are toll-free people who are available in 139 languages. It's like a very involved thing. So just know that you'll see that around, and know that that's a new law coming into town. Yes?
Where are those gonna be posted, like in elementary schools, where would that be posted?
It doesn't specify in the law, but it's suggested that it would be like in the main office, right? Like right in the front when you walk in. Nice little reminder, but that's a great question.
So our internal legal
Yeah.
counsel is working on that.
Perfect.
So we're talking about possibly posting it where we have the McKinney-Vento
Great.
information.
Perfect.
So
Perfect. That's great. Everybody knows where that is? McKinney-Vento posting. Okay, so it's it should be in the front part of the office. And McKinney-Vento is just the law that covers homeless students. So if you become homeless, you would be involved with the homeless liaison who would help you guide you through the process of enrolling in school and transportation and all those things that go into educating homeless students. So that's what, if you hear McKinney-Vento, that's what that means. That's the law for homeless students. Any other questions about that? Now you have free time to ask me anything you want to ask me. Under the sun. Yeah.
What are some symptoms of somebody who would be human trafficked?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, I don't know if I can think of what to look for in that.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't actually provide examples in the law, of course not. My understanding is this is kind of like a DCFS thing, right? Like if you suspect it, you make a call. This isn't something that you're going to get criminal, it's not like DCFS in that you're not going to have criminal charges against you if you fail to report. You're not a mandated reporter of human trafficking. But there's some good articles online that talk about, reclusivity. They actually say that the number one place where people are abducted into human trafficking is like football games. So the Super Bowl is apparently the number one place where people get abducted. Football games, professional sports games. This ring was young students who, it's typically like runaways, kids who run away from home. They end up getting involved in human trafficking. But it's a hard, I think it would almost be like a student actually reporting it, because I don't know how you draw the line between, and if it's a student who's new to your district, perhaps a homeless student that came in and you're kind of unsure about who's in charge of the student, that could be a situation where you might have some flares up a little bit.
I just read an
Yes.
article that a lot of airlines are saying it. That a lot of
Airlines, yeah, and they're
the
actually,
flight attendants are noticing.
and
They'll see a dirty, disheveled, young
Right.
lady with a very
Right.
prominent man.
No, that's a
So
great
she's-
point. And they're actually, my understanding is they receive or there's like an optional training on recognizing those signs. There's not that requirement for school districts at this point, which I wouldn't be surprised if that's something in light of, this is pretty egregious. In light of this happening, there might be a response to that that requires school districts to recognize, but there isn't at this point. So that's a good question. Yeah.
Some of the nurse training that we're looking at receiving, I know Henry Pound will be doing something on human trafficking, so I know the nurses are going to be receiving training.
Oh, great.
Some of the things that we've been told so far, though, that certainly you see the kids who are, looking like homeless street
Right.
children. But they said also the other symptom can be the complete opposite, where you see a kid all of a sudden she's got bling.
Oh,
more money than
interesting.
you would expect.
Right.
Maybe from a nicer household even.
Right.
Where she's gotten into, basically it's prostitution.
Right.
Is ultimately what you're talking about.
Right.
So she's gotten hooked up with somebody who is using her
Right.
in human trafficking, but they will give her some money to get started. So if you notice a student all of a sudden who
Right.
is real tired and has more money than you think she should, or has a really nice phone. Or,
That's a great point.
well, that's what they've been telling nursing staff in buildings, that if you've got somebody who's coming to you because they don't feel well, and you start noticing some of these, talk to them about it.
Interesting.
The other weird thing they told us was sometimes they put tattoos behind their ears.
Really? Interesting. Did everybody hear that? Okay. So that's a nursing training that you guys are doing through the state?
Through the county.
Through the county? Oh, through McHenry. Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
There's a whole, actually,
Interesting.
area on the DCFS website that what are potential indicators of trafficking.
I'll love it.
So, show signs of physical harm, depressed, fearful, withdrawn, having history of runaway, expensive clothing, jewelry, manicures.
There you go.
pedicures. Begin spending time with older boyfriend or girlfriend, be found in hotels or motels, have new tattoos or brandings,
Yeah.
be performing work inappropriate for his or her age level, become isolated from family, friends, or sources of support, no longer have control in his or her driver's license or identification documents, and make reference to having a PIN or a DIN. That's on the DCFS website.
Interesting. And from our vantage point, independent, like there would be a human trafficking call, but there would also be a DCFS call in that situation where we would be reporting that as mandated reporters to DCFS and letting them decide what to do with that. No, that was pretty egregious. Another thing I would refer you to if you feel like nerding out, as I refer it to, the Department of Education and the Illinois State Board of Education, they have a lot of good guidance documents. So if you feel like there's something that with the change of administration, there were actually a few that were pulled from the Department of Education's website. Like one was dealing with transgender students. That's something that's kind of an evolved. Just know that the law is very clear on whether or not transgender students can use the bathroom that they identify with. So the law says, there was a case in Wisconsin, the 7th Circuit, which is a circuit we live in, last year where they just said, listen, bathrooms aren't an issue. Like kids can use whatever bathroom they identify with their gender identity, right? So if they're transitioning from male to female and they want to use the female bathroom, they can do that. An issue that's a little bit more difficult is like locker rooms, and that's something that districts are working on, but that's also very confidential information. So that's not something that you would be alerted to as a parent. If another student's transitioning in the classroom, that's something that would be completely confidential and completely up to the student whether or not they wanted to disclose that. So just know, if it's something that comes up, we are bound to not, share who's transitioning, but we work as collaboratively with families on that. So that's an interesting issue that's been kind of resolved. But that guidance document was online, but there are a number of guidance documents that talk about homeless students, for instance, residency issues. There are guidance documents that talk about students with disabilities. There's a lot of those. IDEA is the federal law that protects students with disabilities in schools. It was drafted in the 70s, passed in the 70s. It's supposed to have been reauthorized. It was last reauthorized, which means like revised in 2004. And it was supposed to be reauthorized, I don't know, probably the last 5 years, more than that. Yeah. And it hasn't yet, so we're still waiting for it to be changed. But it's the law that protects, it's a federal law, so everybody's bound by that in the country. Illinois has some variations on that. But if you have a student with a disability, it's kind of a cumbersome law too. So you should feel free to ask if that's something you're dealing with, ask the administration for help. There's a ton of acronyms in the law. It's kind of confusing. When I first started, I was like, I don't understand this. So it makes sense that it's confusing to parents too. So if that's something you're navigating, you should feel free to reach out to team members about that. Any other questions? Do you guys have anything? Okay. You guys are an awesome group. I'm going to hang around. If there's anything you want to come and ask me, I'm happy to hang around. So it was really nice to meet all of you, and I wish you a wonderful school year, and I hope you all survive Halloween on Wednesday and the candy overdose.